In the middle of his own trial, Captain Malik Johnson, a decorated black Navy officer, was forced into handcuffs by racist cops who claimed security mattered more than justice. The courtroom gasped as his blood hit the rail, but Malik didn't beg. He pressed his cracked watch and calmly warned, "You have 17 minutes to release me." Why would a soldier give such a precise warning, and how could one call inside court shatter the lives of the men who tried to break him? If this injustice stirs you, like and share now. Let's uncover the full story. I was 3 rows back on the left when the afternoon light in Charleston's courthouse turned thin and the air went stale. The fluorescent tubes hummed like tired bees. You could smell old varnish and the sharp tang of paper ink that had been stacked and restacked until the edges curled. People whispered in that courthouse way that sounds like guilt rehearsing its lines. They brought him in without fanfare and still the room shifted. Captain Malik Johnson, 38, black U.S. Navy dress blues, pressed razor-clean ribbons set like quiet stars. He didn't swagger. He didn't shrink. He simply took the defendant's chair and placed both hands on the smooth wood as if to steady not himself but the moment. You could see why the uniform would bother a certain kind of man. It didn't ask for respect, it announced it. Later I learned Malik was out on bond free to appear in civilian clothes, but chose the uniform on purpose. He wanted the court to understand what the paper didn't, that his life had been disciplined service and consequence. If the charge suggested a violent man, the uniform suggested a different truth. The charge itself sounded simple enough when the clerk read it: assaulting an officer during a late-night traffic stop, followed by disturbing the peace. It always sounds simple from a distance. Up close, it got foggy. There were bystanders who said Malik never raised a hand, a camera that somehow wasn't rolling, a report that used a lot of verbs without witnesses to hold them up. You felt the wobble of it before anyone said a word. To my right, a woman gripped a church-softened handbag in both fists. Her wedding band flashed when she squeezed. At her side sat a little girl with serious eyes, shoes not quite touching the floor. The girl kept finding her father's face and then her own shoes again, like looking at him hurt, but not looking hurt worse. They were Malik's wife and daughter, though the court would never say it out loud. Families aren't evidence. They are only weather, the kind that tells you what season you are standing in. When Judge Eleanor Hayes took the bench, the room did that small, straightening people do for a long-kept rule. Hayes had the look of someone who had traded 1,000 small comforts for the word honorable before her name. She didn't rush. She let silence remind us whose house we were in. Then she nodded to the prosecutor. The prosecutor was the tidy kind, sharp tie, sharper part, a voice trimmed to sound inevitable. He didn't waste time. "This isn't about medals," he said, eyes flicking once to Malik's chin. "It's about a man who forgot the law. Even decorated men can be dangerous when they forget the law." The sentence landed with the dull thud of a door closing. A couple of heads in the gallery bobbed, eager to be carried by a current they didn't have to name. Malik didn't take the bait. He met the words the way a wall meets rain: let them hit, let them run off, stayed whole. From where I sat, I could see the muscle jump once along his jaw, the only sign anything had touched him. He slid a manila folder forward, order service records, the subpoena that said you belong here because the law called you. He laid them out with the precision of a man who knew where every corner ought to be. If the prosecutor was eager, Sergeant Brandon Hale was impatient. He stood in the security well with his shoulders cocked forward, the kind of posture that turns a uniform into a dare. Hale had the weary swagger of a man who believed his sidearm did his thinking for him. The younger one beside him, Officer Tyler Grant, shifted from foot to foot, all elbows and second thoughts. Grant's eyes kept landing on Malik's ribbons, then on the wife, then on the judge, as if searching for the safe place the room had misplaced. Hale's attention never left Malik. Not when the clerk shuffled papers. Not when the court reporter tested her keys. He tracked the captain the way a wolf tracks a fence line, looking for the weak board. "Uniform won't help you here," Hale said under his breath, just loud enough to be overheard. It wasn't an official remark, it was a ritual. He wanted the room to absorb the idea that dignity could be stripped like a coat. Judge Hayes turned her head by degrees, the way judges do when they decide whether to sand down an edge or let everyone cut themselves on it. "Sergeant," she said evenly, "you'll maintain decorum. It wasn't thunder, it was a level." Malik's wife exhaled, then a sound more prayer than breath. The little girl took her hand and didn't look up. I remember thinking how strange it was that something as soft as a child's grip could weigh more than a charge sheet. The prosecutor moved on to the story he wanted us to buy a dark shoulder, a raised voice an officer pushed. He let the verbs swell. He let the nouns shrink. He never once said alleged. But the words didn't sit right, not in the presence of the man in front of us. Malik listened like a sailor reads a storm map, respectfully, realistically, already measuring what would be required to outlast it. When it was Malik's turn to speak, he didn't sermonize. I complied, he said, voice low and steady. I said, yes, sir, and no, sir. I placed my hands where they could be seen. I did not strike anyone, no tremor, no heat, just a line drawn straight across a crooked story. Hale snorted a small sound that wanted to be a laugh when it grew up. Grant looked at his boots. The judge asked a few questions, measured and clean. She wrote notes that could have been words or just the distance between what was said and what was true. The prosecutor pressed again, soft on the surface, hard underneath. He wanted a flinch. All he got was posture. Malik's back amassed, his gaze level wall, his replies shorter than the questions. I thought the room might settle, then might become a courthouse again instead of a stage, but you learn things about men by watching what they do when nothing dramatic is happening. Hale couldn't sit inside calm. He needed noise the way some folks need air. His hand drifted to the radio on his shoulder. His eyes drifted to Malik's wrists. It felt like watching a fuse look for a match. Judge Hayes saw it too. We'll proceed by the book, she said. Not a warning and instruction. She meant the book still matters. It should have. It might have if the book had been the only thing in the room. But there was also a man who thought authority was a mirror, and the rest of us were there to reflect him back bigger. There was also a child who understood before some adults did that something wrong was walking around in a suit that looked like right. And there was also a soldier who had picked the most dangerous outfit he could wear the truth. Hale shifted his weight forward a half-inch. It wasn't a move. It was a decision. The fluorescent buzz deepened as if the building itself drew breath. Malek didn't lift his chin. He didn't lower it either. He kept his eyes on the judge and his hands flat where everyone could see them, 10 quiet fingers, the last best argument he had. That was the shape of the room when the first real crack sounded not wood, not bone, but the thin shell that covers a story before it breaks open. The crack, it turned out, was only the prosecutor clearing his throat. Still, it felt like something splitting. He lifted a sheet from his binder, squared it against the wood, and let his voice carry. On the night in question, he read unhurried. Captain Johnson shoved an officer shouting threats while refusing lawful commands. The words were neat, filed official. They sounded like a verdict pretending to be a sentence. Around me, a few people nodded because printed language is persuasive, black ink, white page, no blood. Malik didn't blink. That is not the truth, he said. No thunder, no flourish, just a correction placed squarely where a lie had tried to sit. The prosecutor looked up slow as if he'd been waiting for that exact line to step into his next one. He dropped his gaze to Malik's chest and then brought it back with a smile that never reached his eyes. Your medals don't make you innocent here, Captain. It was theater and we were the audience he wanted. He tilted his body so the gallery could see his profile and hear the judgment inside his certainty. The words weren't about fact. They were about mood. He was painting the same man twice, once in uniform and again in shadow. From the security rail, Sergeant Hale couldn't bear to let someone else hold the brush. He leaned forward and let his voice cut across the room. Uniform doesn't make you noble. It was loud enough to carry, quiet enough to pretend he hadn't meant it for us. People flinched anyway. You could feel the humiliation land public, deliberate, a hand on the back of a neck, pushing a head lower. Malik slid a folder toward the edge of the defendant's table. Smooth, measured. He opened it with his fingertips as if each page had edges that mattered. Orders, service records, the subpoena with his name on it. He set them side by side, aligned the corners, and left them there like a map for anyone who cared to travel by fact. Beside Hale, the younger cop, Officer Tyler Grant, craned for a glance he wasn't supposed to take. He read the top line, swallowed, and whispered almost to himself, "He's listed, he's Navy." Hale didn't even look at the paper. Paperwork gets lost, security checks threats. The sentence made no legal sense. It made perfect emotional sense to men who like power more than procedure. Judge Eleanor Hayes tapped her gavel, once short, precise. "Sergeant," she said without raising her voice in counsel, You will keep to your roles. You will keep to decorum. The sound traveled up the walls and faded. It steadied the furniture, but it didn't reach the air between men. The tilt remained. You could feel it in the way people sat forward to hear the prosecutor and sat back when Malik spoke as if the story had already chosen its lead. The prosecutor resumed turning the page like he was turning a key. He recited distances, times officer positions, an arrow of narrative shot with measurements that sounded scientific until you remembered the missing video and the witnesses who said the arrow never flew. He used verbs with muscles advanced, lunged, resisted, and kept nouns on rations man officer, subject. He never said Malik, the father, Malik, the sailor, Malik, the neighbor. Subjects are easier to move than people. When the judge offered Malik a chance to respond, he didn't wrap himself in the uniform. He didn't perform. He looked at Hayes and spoke like a man making a record for someone honest to find later. I identified myself by rank and name. I placed my hands where they could be seen. I asked if the stop was lawful. I did not shove anyone. I did not shout threats. He turned a palm up, not in appeal but in demonstration. That is what happened. The prosecutor smiled again, thinner this time. Captain, you're trained to keep your voice calm under pressure, aren't you? To project control? He let the question sit there, a trap made of compliments. Sometimes control looks a lot like arrogance, doesn't it? Hale snorted. Grant stared at the floor. I'm trained, Malik said, to follow rules written down, not rules invented on the roadside. A murmur ran through the benches, the kind that tries to be brave and settles for being brief. The judge's eyes narrowed a fraction, not at Malik, but at the word invented. She was deciding whether she had heard accusation or precision. From 3 rows back, I'd call it precision. The prosecutor moved to the final paragraph on his page, the one that loops back to where it started, so the circle feels like destiny. We are not here to impugn the Navy. We are here because, on that night, this man's actions threatened public order, officer safety, and the rule of law. He paused. We asked the court to treat him as you would treat any man who did what the evidence says he did. It was a neat bow. The trouble with neat bows is they make you forget what's inside the box. Judge Hayes leaned into her microphone. Any man counsel is entitled to be treated as this court's rules require. Her tone was dry as bone. Then to Malik, Captain Johnson, keep your answers concise. To the extent you have documentation, put it before the court. A glance to the clerk. Mark the defendant's records for identification. The clerk rose. Papers exchanged hands. Pens scratched. The ritual tried to reassert itself, alphabet number seals. It helped for a breath or two. Then Hale shifted again the way a dog resettles when it hears boots on gravel. He stepped just enough to cast a longer shadow across the defendant's table. It wasn't movement. It was pressure. Malik kept his gaze on the judge and his fingertips on the edges of his documents. From where I sat, I could see his wedding band glint once a small defiance of statistics. Grant leaned in toward Hale, voice hardly more than breath. Sergeant? He's in the log. The subpoena's clean. Hale didn't lower his voice. Logs get cleaned, he said. Threats don't. The gallery heard it. We weren't supposed to, but we did, and the knowledge settled on us like dust. The tilt grew. It wasn't just the state against a man anymore. It was the room. Malik's wife pressed a tissue to her mouth. The little girl watched the judge the way you watch a traffic light, begging it to change, because you can't make it. The prosecutor shuffled his pages and looked satisfied with himself, like a man who had pushed a piano a few inches and wanted credit for moving the house. He sat smoothing his tie, confident that momentum would do the rest. The judge's gavel came down again, 2 measured taps, more metronome than hammer. We proceed by evidence, she said, not by commentary, not by suggestion. She meant it. I believe she did. But belief is lighter than gravity. The gravity in that room belonged to a uniform some men wanted to strip and a voice they wanted to rename as threat. The gravity belonged to a phrase thrown like a stone. Uniform doesn't make you noble, and to another stuck like a mantra. Paperwork gets lost. Malik gathered a paper he'd slid too far forward, aligned it with the others, and let his shoulders settle into a posture that looked a lot like readiness. The prosecutor marked his notes for a cross he planned to make later. Hale stared at Malik's wrists as if they were already cuffed. Grant checked the clock once then again, and a sheen of sweat stood on his upper lip. Captain Judge Hayes said you'll answer the next series directly. Counsel, keep your questions narrow. And just like that, the ritual resumed, but thinner, like a thread pulled too tight across a gap. The questions came faster, the answers shorter, the room more eager to mishear. We hadn't reached violence, not yet, but we had arrived at something nearly as dangerous, the moment when truth starts losing to volume. I thought I could feel the story deciding what it wanted to be. Not a case, not a file, not even a fight. A test of a bench's spine, of a soldier's restraint, of whether a uniform is armor or invitation, of whether law is a level or just another tilted table. The prosecutor lifted his chin for one last shot in the round. Captain, do you deny raising your voice? I do, Malik said. Hale laughed under his breath. Do you deny putting hands on an officer? I do. And do you deny disturbing the peace? Malik glanced once at his wife, then at his daughter, then at the judge. I am trying, he said, to restore it. The answer wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Even the prosecutor seemed to feel it, the way a man feels a breeze before the storm that made it. He sat. Hale rolled his shoulders like a boxer about to ring the bell himself. Grant's whisper rose and died in his throat. Judge Hayes nodded to the clerk. We'll mark the exhibits and continue. She drew breath for the next instruction. That's when Hale moved, not far, not fast, just enough to make the air in front of his. Enough to tell the room what would happen when a man who hated documents decided to write his own. Hale didn't wait for permission. He stepped out of the security well and came straight to the defense table until his belt brushed the edge. From where I sat, I saw his shadow climb across the wood and swallow Captain Malik Johnson's hands. The room tightened, benches creaked, breath shortened, even the lights seemed to buzz harder. Malik didn't flinch. He raised his chin just enough to meet Hale's eyes and said, steady as a line drawn with a ruler, I'm here to answer to the court. Nothing more. It should have ended there, words in a room made for words. Instead, Hale reached down and yanked Malik's wrist so fast the chair feet scraped. He slammed Malik's forearm to the table. The sound thud wasn't loud, but it was final. Malik's head clipped the corner of the rail, and a thin line of blood opened along his temple, as neat as if someone had unzipped the skin. There's a kind of silence that follows pain you didn't expect to see. It isn't shock so much as a room losing its balance. People around me froze with their mouths half open. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, then dropped. The clerk's pen drew a streak across a margin that was meant to stay clean. Hale filled the silence with a line that sounded practiced. Stop resisting, he barked like a cue he'd been waiting to deliver. Malik's face was turned toward the wood, but his voice came out clear. Not pleading, not angry, I am not resisting. I believed him because I could see his hands, fingers open, palm flat, the kind of posture your body adopts when it's trying to convince the world it won't be the problem. Blood traveled from the cut down to his cheekbone and began its slow drip onto the table's polished surface. Behind me, a sob broke loose. I turned just enough to see Malik's wife press both hands to her mouth. Their daughter, small, serious, too young to be learning this, wrapped herself around her mother's arm and wouldn't let go. A bailiff shifted his weight like his legs had to choose between duty and decency. Sergeant, step back! Judge Eleanor Hayes snapped her gavel, striking once. The sound was clean and honest, the kind that used to fix things. Hale didn't step back. He leaned, he rolled his weight across Malik's shoulders, the way a man leans into a stuck door. Stop. Resisting, he repeated slower, as if spacing the words might manufacture the truth he needed. The bailiff moved quick and firm, coming to the corner of the table where he could matter. This is a courtroom, not your precinct, he said. His hand hovered near Hale's elbow, not touching ready. Hale cut him a look so cold it felt like a draft. Then stay out of my way, he said, not loud, but with that tone men use to promise trouble. The prosecutor rose an inch and sat back down, ambition calculating risk. Officer Tyler Grant looked like he wanted to speak and found out his throat had locked. He stared at Malik's wrists, at the open hand pinned to wood at the watch face, shining faint beneath a smear of blood. Sergeant Judge Hayes said again, now lower, now sharper. If you continue, you will be held in contempt. Hale didn't answer her. He kept his eyes on Malik, a stare that felt personal where it should have been procedural. I remember thinking how small the distance was between order and humiliation, how quickly a room designed for one could be hijacked by the other. Malik did not struggle. He set his voice in that space between pain and purpose. I will comply with the court, he said. I will answer the court. He did not say Hale's name. He did not give him ownership of the moment. The gallery had gone stone still. It wasn't respect. It was fear of adding weight to a scale that had already tipped. Somewhere a phone vibrated against wood, and no one reached for it, as if moving would make us accomplices. The bailiff tried again. Sergeant stepped back. Now. He wasn't asking anymore. Hale's lip curled just enough to show he understood the word now and didn't accept it. Security is mine, he said. I said he's resisting. He pressed Malik's arm harder until the tendon stood out. The cut on Malik's temple widened, and the drip became a bead. Judge Hayes stood. Enough. The single word landed like a line drawn on tile. You will remove your hands, Sergeant, or you will remove yourself from this courtroom. It should have mattered. In a different version of the day, it would have. But authority, when challenged in public, sometimes doubles down for the sake of the audience it imagines. Hale's audience wasn't the judge. It wasn't the law. It was the room, the watching, the whispering, the silent nods that feel like permission if you're starved for it. Stop resisting, he said again, softer now, as if he were narrating a video he wished he had. Malik's wife cried openly, then no longer able to pack the sound back into her chest. The little girl closed her eyes and held on. The prosecutor adjusted his tie as if that could return him to the center of the story. It could not. He was a footnote now. The scene had been stolen by a man in a badge who wanted it more. Grant's mouth moved. Nothing came. He looked at the judge, at the bailiff, at Hale, and then at his own hands like they were keys he didn't know how to use. Sergeant, the judge warned, this is your last. Hale shifted his grip, quick and impersonal, the way you handle an object. Malik's knuckles whitened under the pressure, but his voice did not change. I am not resisting, he said again, giving the court a record to outlive the moment. The bailiff took half a step closer, and for a heartbeat, I thought we might see two officers on opposite sides of a line that didn't used to be visible. Then he stopped. He knew what would happen if he moved first headlines that lie and footage that doesn't. The air in the room changed temperature. That's not a metaphor. You could feel it, like the AC had cut off or the sun had walked to a different part of the sky. People folded their hands in their laps to keep from doing something they'd have to explain. The court reporter, to her credit, kept typing. Malik lifted his head as far as Hale's weight allowed. He aimed his words at the bench. Your Honor, he said, I'm here to answer your questions. Judge Hayes' eyes met his. Something like resolve crossed her face. She turned to the bailiff. Deputy, you will separate the sergeant from the defendant. Now, that now echoed. The bailiff planted his feet, squared his shoulders, and let his hands settle firm on Hale's forearm. Step back, he said, voice even, or we both write separate reports and mine will read clean. Hale hesitated. It was only a blink, but in a room running on momentum, a blink is a crack. The crack wasn't big enough yet for justice to walk through it, but it was big enough to prove the door wasn't welded shut. He eased a fraction, not a retreat, a pause. For the first time since the thud, the room breathed. Chairs creaked as spines remembered how to be vertical. Malik's wife lowered her hands but kept the tissue in place. Grant's shoulders fell an inch, as if the weight he was carrying had shifted, but not left. From my row, I could see the smear of red on the wood, the way it had wanted to spread, and the way the table refused it. I could see Malik's open palm patient in public, and I understood in that exact second how a man can be moved from defendant to victim without changing his seat. Judge Hayes sat slowly, gavel in her hand, but not yet raised. We will proceed, she said, voice steady. By the book. Maybe we would. Maybe we wouldn't. But the book was back on the table, and for the first time all afternoon, I believed it could be read. Hale's hesitation lasted only a breath. Then the cuffs came out. Cold steel snapped around Captain Malik Johnson's wrists, right there at the defendant's table. The metallic click carried through the courtroom like a gavel of its own, sharp, final, humiliating. Blood from Malik's temple slid along his cheek and down onto his hand. It met the cracked face of his military watch, pooling in the hairline fracture. The glow of its tiny dial flickered green as Malik pressed his thumb against it, so subtle you'd think it was an accident, if not for the stillness in his eyes. He lifted his head, face pale but posture unbroken. His voice calm and level spread across the room. You have 17 minutes to release me. The words didn't rise. They didn't strain. They sat there like a clock no one remembered setting. The gallery fell silent. Even the judge's pen stopped mid-note. A woman whispered from the second row, 17 minutes. Why 17? Her question drifted over the benches, passed from ear to ear, until it filled the air with confusion. Hale straightened, then barked out a laugh that was too loud for the space. 17 minutes in here, I'm the law. He spread his hands wide as if the room itself would nod along. But no one did. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Her gaze darted to the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping its circle, steady and merciless. Her brow pinched tight the way it does when a judge knows something has entered the record without her consent. Malik sat perfectly still, wrist-bound blood drying into dark streaks against navy blue. His face didn't argue. It didn't plead. It simply held. What no one in that gallery knew not yet was that 17 minutes wasn't theater. It was the coded response time of Protocol Delta 7, a federal safeguard written to protect military personnel unlawfully detained in civilian courts. 17 minutes was the window before the protocol escalated to federal intervention. Of course, the gallery didn't know. The judge might have guessed, and Hale dismissed it outright because men like him believe no rule exists outside their own reflection. I caught Officer Tyler Grant's eyes then. He had been pale before, now he looked stricken. His gaze darted to Malik, to the watch glowing faintly under cuff and blood. For the first time since the trial began, I saw Grant's certainty crack. Malik didn't look at him. He didn't look at anyone. His stare fixed on the judge, calm, rooted, unshaken. It was that calm that unnerved the room most. Not the blood, not the cuffs, not even the number. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knew something the rest of us didn't. Grant's lips parted as if to speak, but he stopped himself. Instead, he whispered low enough for no one but Hale to hear. 17 minutes. What if he's serious? Hale ignored him. He tightened his grip on Malik's shoulder, laughing again, but louder this time, trying to drown out the doubt. The clock ticked. The seconds counted. And we all waited, not knowing why, but knowing that for once the weight in the room wasn't carried by Hale's rage. It was carried by Malik's quiet countdown. Sergeant Hale didn't hesitate. He grabbed Captain Malik Johnson by the cuffs and yanked him to his feet. The legs of the chair screeched against the floor, the sound sharp enough to make a few people in the gallery flinch. "Release him, Sergeant. That's an order." Judge Hayes' voice cut through the air, sharper than her gavel, which struck again and again. The sound echoed, but it was hollow, like a hammer hitting a coffin lid. No one moved to enforce it. Hale had already claimed the space. He dragged Malik toward the doors, boots scuffing against marble, the cuffs biting into his wrists. The gallery had gone from gasps to stunned silence, everyone watching as a man in uniform was hauled like contraband from the very room meant to weigh truth. The heavy doors burst open, spilling them into the courthouse hallway. The air there was colder, harsher, filled with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. Portraits of long-dead judges lined the walls, their painted eyes following, as if amused by the repetition of history. I swear some of those smiles looked smug, like they'd been waiting decades for this exact cruelty to play again. A young clerk rushed from behind, her papers clutched tight, her face pale with something between fear and outrage. "He's a U.S. Navy officer," she cried, her voice trembling but loud enough to echo down the corridor. Hale snapped his head back, jaw tight, eyes blazing. "Back to your post," he barked the command, cracking like a whip. She froze mid-stride, her courage colliding with the weight of his authority. The papers in her hand trembled. She stopped. Just like that, her attempt to help evaporated into silence. Grant followed close behind, his face sickly, his eyes darting between Malik and Hale. His voice was low, almost pleading, as though trying not to awaken Hale's fury. "We don't have grounds," he muttered. "He hasn't done anything." Hale jerked him closer by the collar, his voice dripping venom, but still loud enough to be heard. "Promotions come from numbers, not kindness." "Shut up!" There it was, the mask, slipping the truth behind the charade. This wasn't justice. It was a ledger. It was quota hunting dressed in uniform. And Malik was just the latest entry in a system fattened on broken lives. Malik didn't fight. He didn't plead. His eyes swept the hall, the lights buzzing above the portraits, glaring down. And then for a moment, he wasn't in 2D25. He was in 1945, standing in the memory that his family had carried like a scar. He saw it as clear as the paint on those portraits, his grandfather, Elias Johnson, coming home from Europe, in his own uniform. Elias had survived battlefields across the ocean only to meet fists and boots on these very courthouse steps. His dignity had bled into the same stone floors his service dismissed his uniform mocked. Malik's voice came out low, almost to himself, almost a prayer. This isn't the first time dignity bled here. The words carried anyway, riding the cold hum of the lights sinking into the marble walls like truth long ignored but never erased. Grant's eyes flicked to him, caught in the weight of those words. For the first time, the young officer's certainty faltered. Hale didn't notice. He was too busy hauling Malik further down the corridor, convinced he was marching toward control, when really he was walking into history's trap. And all of us who watched, we knew it. We felt it. We weren't just witnesses to an arrest. We were watching ghosts step back into the hallway demanding to be remembered. The cuffs rattled with each step as Sergeant Hale dragged Captain Malik Johnson toward the stairwell leading down to the holding cells. The sound was sharp against the marble floor, echoing like chains meant to remind everyone watching who carried the power. On Malik's wrist, his military watch flickered faintly through the blood, the cracked face pulsing with a green glow. It wasn't bright, but it was steady like a clock, ticking louder than the silence around us. Just before the landing, the bailiff stepped forward, planting his feet in the center of the hall. His voice was firm, though I could hear the hesitation beneath it. Paperwork's not cleared. You can't take him down yet. Hale stopped just short, yanking Malik closer against his side. His eyes narrowed, jaw clenching tight. Step aside, or you'll be next. The words weren't shouted, but they cut through the hallway with enough force to make the fluorescent light seem harsher. The bailiff froze. His hand twitched as if it wanted to reach for his radio, but his body betrayed him. He stepped back, not in consent, but in defeat. His eyes flicked toward the courtroom doors, toward Judge Hayes, as though begging her to reclaim the ground slipping away. She wasn't there yet. Not visibly. Malik stood taller, blood streaking his face, but his dignity intact. His voice was calm, so calm it unnerved me. When the time ends, truth arrives. The words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like a prophecy, something written long before this hallway, spoken for ears that had no choice but to hear. They lingered in the air long after he closed his mouth. I watched Officer Grant then. He had been pale since the courtroom, but now sweat beaded on his brow, sliding down the side of his face. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall above the stairwell, and he couldn't seem to look away. The second hand moved deliberate, merciless. Each tick landed like a hammer inside the silence. Grant swallowed hard, his Adam's apple rising and falling like a man choking on time itself. Hale tugged Malik forward again, but the moment felt heavier than his pull. Everyone in that corridor knew something had shifted. The cuffs might have belonged to Hale, but the weight, the gravity of the moment belonged to Malik. Back at the doorway, Judge Eleanor Hayes appeared at last. She didn't shout this time. She didn't even speak. Her eyes locked onto the scene before her, the soldier in cuffs, the sergeant clutching him, the bailiff pushed aside. In her hand, her gavel rested against her palm, knuckles white from how tightly she held it. She didn't move, but I could feel her waiting, measuring as if she knew what the rest of us were only beginning to sense. The hallway had become more than stone and portraits. It was a stage caught between two clocks, Hale's fury pulling Malik downward, and another countdown none of us could see, but all of us could feel. I remember noticing the portraits of old judges on the wall-painted faces watching with stiff smiles that suddenly felt mocking, as if history itself was smirking at how easily it could repeat. Hale sneered, tugging harder, trying to remind everyone that muscle still ruled the moment. But Malik didn't resist. He let himself be pulled, his voice the only anchor. When the time ends, he'd said, truth arrives. And with every tick of that stairwell clock, the words felt less like defiance and more like certainty. Grant wiped at his forehead, his hand trembling. He whispered something I couldn't catch, maybe a prayer, maybe just a name. He glanced at Hale but didn't speak louder. Fear had already sealed his throat. For the rest of us, breathing felt like participation. So we held it. The only sound was the rhythm of the watch on Malik's wrist and the sweep of the clock above. 17 minutes. That was the promise. And though no one in that hallway knew why, we all leaned into the silence as if waiting for the strike of a bell. The bailiff stood off to the side, shame carved into his face. The clerk who had shouted earlier stood frozen at the far end, her papers clutched against her chest, her eyes wide. Judge Hayes's gaze stayed fixed, unblinking, her gavel like a weight she hadn't yet dropped. And me. I sat in that silence 3 rows back in my mind, and I knew. We weren't just watching an arrest. We were watching the countdown to something larger, something that would decide who truly owned that building, the men with cuffs or the man who dared to bleed with dignity. We were 5, maybe 6 minutes from the end of Malik's countdown when the air changed. Not metaphor sound. A low rumble rolled under the floor, gathered itself and grew. Heads turned toward the back of the building, toward the loading bay. Most of us never noticed. Then it hit in full, 3 black SUVs, engines growling in sync like a single machine with 3 hearts. The hallway froze. Hale kept his grip on Captain Malik Johnson's cuffs, but his eyes flicked toward the sound the way a man checks a shadow he swears he didn't see. Doors at the far end burst open on a gust of heat and sunlight. 6 plainclothes agents moved in with the kind of calm that doesn't need volume. No flashing badges, no bark theatrics, just presence. 2 took positions at the stairwell and the exit. 1 hung back, scanning faces. The lead stepped into the center of the corridor. "Special Agent Marcus Reed, Department of Defense," he said, holding up ID leather and steel. The tone was flat, official, and unimpressed by the drama he'd walked into. His eyes landed on Malik, then on the cuffs, then on Hale's hand. "Captain Johnson is under active protection, Protocol Delta 7. The words detonated without noise. You could feel it the way a building feels, thunder through its bones. The clerk at the far end clutched her papers tighter. The bailiff straightened as if someone had returned his spine. Hale squared himself, rage moving in to hide his doubt. "This is my courthouse," he snapped, like jurisdiction could be summoned by volume. Before Reed could answer, Judge Eleanor Hayes stepped fully into the doorway from the courtroom. She didn't raise her gavel. She didn't need to. "This court acknowledges Delta 7's jurisdiction," she declared, every syllable clean. The line landed like a bridge lowered for the right army. Reed gave the smallest nod, then looked back to Hale. "Not when you assault a U.S. service member on record." He didn't blink. "Remove your hand from the defendant." Hale didn't move. The hallway felt narrower by the inch. One of Reed's agents shifted half a step, blocking the path to the cells with a posture that translated into any language no farther. Hale tried again, going louder. "The defendant is resisting detention. He stays cuffed." He threw the word defendant like a weight. Reed didn't match the volume. He turned his head just enough to address the younger cop. Officer Grant unlocked the cuffs. Silence tightened. Grant's eyes snapped to Hale, then to Judge Hayes, then to Malik, blood drying at the temple, face steady, watch throbbing, faint green under steel. Grant's throat worked. His hand hovered over his belt, fingers shaking. "Don't unlock him," Hale barked, stepping into Grant's space as if proximity could be policy. Reed didn't budge. "Officer," he said, softer, more dangerous, "unlock the cuffs." The second hand on the stairwell clock clicked forward. One more tooth, one more demand of courage. Grant's gaze met Malik's for a breath, just long enough to find something that wasn't fear looking back at him. He reached for the key. Hale lunged a half step, but the bailiff moved at the same time, a clean block that said, "Not today," without saying a word. Judge Hayes's jaw set. Reed's agents didn't flinch. Grant's fingers found the lock. For a heartbeat, he missed the slot. He steadied, turned. Click. It was a small sound for what it did. The metal opened and Malik's wrists came apart from each other like a verdict reversed. You could hear people breathe again. Someone sobbed once and then swallowed it. The clerk exhaled a prayer she hadn't meant to say out loud. Hale stood there stunned, the narrative ripped from his hands. His mouth worked around a protest that never found its shape. He looked from Reed to the judge, to the open cuffs, as if the room had betrayed him. Reed didn't gloat. He angled to Malik, eyes scanning the cut at his temple. "Captain, are you ambulatory?" he asked, clinical and kind all at once. "I am," Malik said, his voice the same calm that had carried us here. Reed faced Hale again. "This corridor is now secure. Further contact with Captain Johnson will be treated as interference with a federal protocol." He didn't raise a badge. He raised the expectation that men would behave. The hallway broke not into chaos, but into relief. Shoulders dropped. The bailiff's stance widened like a man finally allowed to do his job. Judge Hayes gave a single nod that said, "Proceed to the right side at last." Behind all of it, the clock on the wall kept time, indifferent and honest. If you'd asked me right then what I heard, I'd say, not engines, not orders, not even that perfect click. I heard a countdown end, and in the space it left, the first real measure of law took its place. They brought us back in before the light could change. Same benches, same seal above the bench, but the air felt reordered, as if furniture had stayed put and truth had been moved to the front row. Judge Eleanor Hayes took the bench without ceremony. No jury, no speeches, just one line to set the terms. We are reconvened for an emergency evidentiary hearing. A projector hummed. The clerk wheeled in a cart of binders, labels facing out like a promise. Judge Hayes lifted a hand. The court will control the presentation, she said. Clerk mark and publish. Exhibit A snapped onto the wall, traffic stop data from 2 years of patrols overseen by Sergeant Hale. Rows, dates, outcomes. No dramatics, just numbers doing what numbers do when you let them. The clerk read steadily so the record could hear itself. 90% of cited or arrested drivers during targeted patrols are black, she said. Same corridors, same violations, different outcomes. A low sound passed through the gallery. Not outrage, yet recognition. The kind that makes you think of all the times you knew and didn't have the chart to prove it. Someone behind me whispered, "There it is," and someone else answered, "There it's been." Hale stared at the screen like he could outstare math. At the defense table, Officer Tyler Grant kept his eyes down, jaw tight, hands quiet in his lap. Exhibit B, the clerk announced. Emails filled the wall headers, timestamps, recipients. The cursor opened a thread from Chief Richard Whitmore. The clerk read the line that took the air out of the room. Concentrate patrols in North Charleston. Minority arrest ratios will boost funding. Dozens inhaled at once. The young clerk who had shouted for Malik in the hallway pressed a hand to her mouth. A man in the second row shook his head like he could rattle the words loose. Whitmore sat immaculate, tie straight, in expression arranged, annoyed more than alarmed, as if honesty were a breach of etiquette. Read the full paragraph, Judge Hayes said. Slowly. The rest was worse because it sounded reasonable. Administrative phrasing, careful and bloodless, until you set it beside the chart. The court reporter's keys stitched every syllable into the record. From the back row, an old man in a faded Navy cap rose to his feet. He lifted 2 fingers in a small salute toward Malik. "We waited decades for this," he said. No one told him to sit. Some sentences carry their own permission. Exhibit C, the clerk said. The wall went dark, then opened on body cam footage, Hale's chest in the frame, the courtroom rail, Malik's shoulders pinned. Audio clean as a blade. Hale's voice, "Stop resisting." The video showed Malik's hands flat and still, his face turned toward the bench, not moving. A note in the corner identified the source copy preserved by Officer Tyler Grant. The gallery didn't erupt. It recoiled. A single sob, a nervous laugh crushed into a cough. People stared at the still frame as if it might change if they held it with their eyes long enough. Whitmore finally spoke, a thin smile at the edge of his mouth. "Systems don't bend for outrage," he said. "Not to the judge, to the air. The kind of line a man collects for moments when he thinks the room belongs to him." Malik didn't look over. He looked up at the bench. "Then outrage today bends the system," he said. "No heat, just torque." The prosecutor rose as if to object, found nothing procedural to grab, and sat back down. Special Agent Marcus Reed stood in the aisle, hands loose, eyes moving, not hunting a fight, just ready if one arrived. Judge Hayes tapped the gavel once, not to silence, but to focus. "The exhibits are received," she said. Clerk read each into the record, titles, dates, authors, recipients. "We will be precise," so they were. Names, timestamps, subject lines, attachments. The clerk's voice didn't waver. The reporter didn't miss. Exhibit A became a shape no one could pretend not to see. Exhibit B became motive you could print. Exhibit C became the difference between a script and a fact. Hale seemed to shrink without moving. It's a thing some men do when the narrative leaves them. The room stops making extra space. Grant stared at his folded hands and let them stay still, as if restraint could finally count as action. When the last line was read, Judge Hayes set the gavel down. "Not a strike, a placement. This court recognizes a pattern," she said, "and this court will act on a record, not a ritual." In the back, the veteran lowered himself carefully to the bench. At the front, Malik's wife finally exhaled and found their daughter's hand. On the wall, the body cam frame held steady, Hale's command, repeating Malik's stillness, refuting truth captured in pixels that would not be bullied. We weren't done. Not yet. Another feed waited just out of frame, one that didn't ask to be believed, only to be seen. And when it arrived, the room would learn the difference between evidence and exposure. The lights dimmed, and the projector hummed again. This time the screen didn't show a single chart or a thread of emails. It opened onto something bigger, Sentinel. A black interface, white text pouring down the wall in endless rows. Not just a document, but a vault. Names, dates, arrest logs, internal memos. Every click unveiled more hundreds of falsified reports, quotas dressed as policy lives reduced to numbers. The room seemed to fold in on itself. We weren't looking at evidence anymore. We were staring into a machine that had been humming for years while no one stopped it. Special Agent Marcus Reed stepped forward, his voice flat as if reading scripture carved in stone. This archive has been compiled for months. Sentinel documents a pattern and practice operation. Charleston PD is under federal investigation. No one moved. Even the air felt pinned. Then motioned 2 U.S. Marshals in dark suits crossed the space clean and deliberate and closed on Sergeant Hale. His jaw was set, but the color had drained from his face. He started to speak something about jurisdiction, about procedure, but it fell apart under the weight of the clicking cuffs. The sound landed like punctuation at the end of a long, ugly sentence. Behind him, Officer Grant rose slowly. His eyes were wet, his shoulders slumped like he had aged 10 years in one afternoon. He didn't wait for anyone to order him. He brought his hands forward and wrists open. "I can't lie anymore," he said, his voice breaking halfway through. The clerk's hand flew to her mouth. A ripple moved through the gallery, not shock, but something quieter, heavier. Relief mixed with sorrow. At the defense table, Chief Richard Whitmore finally lost his composure. His posture stiffened, but his skin went pale. A marshal handed him a summons right there in front of everyone. The judge's gavel struck, cutting clean through the murmur. "Chief Whitmore, you are hereby ordered to comply with federal questioning and immediate production of communications." For the first time all day, Whitmore blinked too often. The man who had lectured about systems enduring now looked like a system breaking in plain view. Judge Hayes let the silence stretch, then spoke again, her tone steadier than I'd ever heard it. "This court chooses light." The words didn't echo. They landed. And then from somewhere in the gallery, a slow clap began, hesitant, fragile. Another joined, then more. Not raucous, not defiant, just the sound of people giving the moment back to itself. A few older men and women wiped their eyes, their hands trembling, as if they'd carried decades waiting for a day like this. I looked at Captain Malik Johnson. He still sat in the defendant's chair, though it no longer looked like it belonged to him. A strip of white bandage marked his temple, stark against his skin. His wrists were free now, resting calm on the wood. His eyes were steady, not gloating, not relieved, just anchored. Hours earlier, they had painted him as a criminal. Now, without moving from that chair, he had become something else, a symbol of justice claimed in the open. The applause didn't swell into noise. It stayed slow, deliberate, as though the room knew clapping too hard might break the moment. Tears slipped down faces lined with aged men and women who had seen this city bend the wrong way for too long. And in the center of it all sat Malik, once the accused, now the witness. Not just to his own defense, but to a truth no one could bury anymore. The screen behind him still glowed with Sentinel's cold text, a reminder that this wasn't finished. The files listed names that would never stand where he stood, cases that would never have a courtroom to echo their innocence. But for now, the weight had shifted. The cuffs were on the right wrists. The gavel had chosen its side. And Malik Johnson, bloodied but unbowed, remained at the rail, not a defendant, but a man whose dignity had forced the walls to remember their purpose. A year later, the courthouse looked the same, but I swear it felt different. The fluorescent lights still buzzed. The portraits of judges still lined the walls with their practiced solemnity. Yet the air no longer pressed down the way it had that day. It carried something lighter, memory maybe, or the residue of a wound learning how to heal. Major Malik Johnson, promoted since the trial, walked through the same doors he had once been dragged across. His stride was steady, his uniform pressed sharp, but his eyes lingered on the defense table. He paused, their fingertips brushing the scarred wood where his blood had fallen a year earlier. An old veteran stepped forward from the gallery, his hand trembling, but his grip strong when he clasped Malik's. His voice cracked, but his words held weight. You carried the fight we couldn't finish. Malik didn't smile. He nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement. The fight isn't over, he said softly, the sound carrying through the hush. But today we won a battle. He reached into his case and unfolded a sheet, the Sentinel list. Row after row of names filled the page. Men and women who had never had their chance in the light. Some long gone, some still waiting, all tethered to a system that had weighed them wrong. Malik studied it for a moment, shoulders tight. Justice had cracked open, but not yet flowed far enough. Before he turned to leave, Malik pulled out a small envelope, edges softened from being read too often. The judge had returned to her chambers. The benches were mostly empty, but he opened it as though the room itself needed to hear. It was a letter written in an unsteady hand, the wife of Officer Grant. Thank you for forcing him to see what he refused to see. Our children will grow up in a better world because of what you endured. The words hung there fragile, almost private, but they mattered more than any verdict. They were proof that justice had reached not only institutions, but kitchens and bedrooms, and children who might live lighter than their parents. Malik folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked up. The seal of justice carved above the bench loomed in bronze and shadow. It had looked ornamental that day when Hale pressed him down. Today it looked heavier, as if finally willing to carry its own meaning. He whispered, not for applause, not for record, but for the truth that lives between one heartbeat and the next. One call can rattle a system. Real justice takes every call after. No one cheered, no one clapped. The words weren't built for noise, they were built for memory, for vow. And that's how the story ended. Not with fireworks, not with triumph, shouted into microphones, but with a quiet promise in a quiet hall. A promise that justice is not a single moment, not a single trial, not even a single man. It's a fight carried forward every day, often silently, always costly, but never optional. Major Johnson left the courthouse the way he entered it, shoulders straight, head high. But the rest of us, we left knowing that dignity isn't given, it's defended. And sometimes it takes just one act, one voice, one call to remind us all what the law is supposed to mean. That vow lingered in the hall long after he was gone, an oath not carved in marble, but carried in us each step, a reminder that justice is alive only if we guard it. Justice, dignity, and truth are never handed out freely. They're defended often at great cost and carried forward by those who refuse to stay silent. Malik's story reminds us that one voice, one act of courage can shake an entire system and inspire change for generations to come. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more powerful stories that shine a light on courage, resilience, and justice. Your support means more than numbers. It's the strength that keeps our team creating meaningful content. Remember this, whenever you think of justice standing tall, think of Mr. Mac Stories, where every story is a spark that keeps hope alive.